Um, I was going to begin the discussion here by having each person give a small presentation about the work they have done. And in that regard, Ariana, I think we're starting with you today. So you can go ahead. I'll turn my screen off while you're talking.
Perfect. I am hoping that you can all see my screen.
Looks great.
Great. Well, thank you for having me here. It's a huge honor to be with this incredibly distinguished panel. I really feel like an imposter for many reasons. But let me start, I suppose, by the obvious. As you said, my book was published in 2020. And if you had met me 3 years before that, I would have told you that I had been researching my family history for 10 years. But I wouldn't have told you that I was writing a book, because I wasn't. And actually, if you have met me when I went to college or just before, I would have told you that I had no connection whatsoever to the Holocaust or to Judaism. So it's been quite a long journey here to where I am today. And for you to understand my long journey in writing this book, we're going to have to go back to my childhood. So I'm going to do something rather strange, because most people hide their baby pictures. I'm actually going to show you my baby videos. And please forgive me, it's a rather personal video, but then it's a very personal journey of discovery. So you're coming back with me to the Venezuela of the 70s and the 80s, a beautiful country filled with potential and promise, very different than the Venezuela today, and very far away from World War II. And as you can see there, I was an extremely funny looking child. I was the only child of a second marriage. My father was 50 by the time I came along, and he was a very successful industrialist. He was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was involved in pretty much everything you could think of, from museums to newspapers to education to industry. And it sort of didn't seem strange, really, that he didn't speak about the past, because him and my mother, where they both worked, they were all incredibly busy, and they were always, talking about their present rather than their past. So all I really knew as I was growing up in this beautiful, vibrant, luminous place was that my father had emigrated from Prague in 1949, that he had emigrated with his brother, his older brother Lothar, and I was never really told why. I seem to remember that phrase, escaping a broken Europe, but I wasn't quite sure when that was told to me. But I knew nothing about his life before Venezuela. He never discussed his family. He never discussed certainly his family in Prague, and he never discussed religion, for example. And in this beautiful house in the middle of the gardens, I grew up an only child, but I had lots of cousins, some of who you see there, and friends. And more than anything in the world, I wanted to be a detective. I don't know if it was reading Enid Blyton, or if it was reading Harriet the Spy, or maybe it was because I sensed that there was a mystery around my dad. There certainly was a sort of intangible darkness that seemed to seep through this beautiful Technicolor world I inhabited in my childhood. But I set up a detective club because I wanted to solve mysteries. And I suppose I didn't know then that the biggest mystery I would solve many decades later would be the mystery of my dad. I had clues that not all was what it seemed in my father's life. Despite a seeming lack of worries, my father would wake up not once or twice, but dozens of times. I remember literally dozens of times of him screaming, and it would be the middle of the night. He'd wake up the whole house. He would be covered in sweat, incredibly agitated, and he was always screaming in a language that I didn't understand. And then in a house filled with photographs, my mother was incredibly beautiful. There were lots of pictures of her family. She came from a huge, Latin, vibrant, crazy family. So there were pictures of the great aunts and the uncles and the third cousins once removed, and they were all beautiful and posed and smiling. There was only one picture of my father's family, and there was a tiny photograph, black and white, by his bedside, And it showed people that weren't smiling, that weren't posing, and that seemed rather distant from my life. And whenever I asked any questions about them or about my father's past, they were pretty much met with a wall of silence. I sometimes got cursory details, like I knew their names, Ella and Otto. I knew that my grandmother liked music and singing, and that my grandfather was rather strict, and that they had a paint factory in Prague. But that's pretty much all I knew of them. And if I asked a little more, my father would often, if you looked carefully, start to shake. And I loved him, and I didn't want to upset him. So I learned very quickly not to ask any questions. And then, playing detective one afternoon, as I often did, in a box, I found this card. And it was completely wrong. It was a photograph of my father. I recognized his eyes. I knew it was him, even though he was much more wrinkled by the time I came along. So I had no doubt. But the stamp of beneath his face was just jarring. And the fact that it said Berlin made no sense, because my father, I knew, was from Prague. So why would it say Berlin? And then the name was not my father's name. My father was called Hans Neumann. And this card said Jan Sebesta. So I ran to my mother and I said, actually, you're married to an imposter. He's not who he says he is. And she calmed me down and she said, no, he's not an imposter. He had a difficult war and he had to pretend to be someone else for a little while, and he doesn't like to talk about it. But I think that was the moment that I knew that there was a mystery that I would have to solve, a mystery that my father couldn't help me solve, really, so that I would have to solve on my own. And then in 2001, my father dies, and he leaves me a box crammed with documents from his life during World War II. And that box starts to answer many of my questions, but it also triggers many more. And then as I ask questions of my Uncle Lotter's daughters, I find another box in my uncle's house with dozens of long letters. This is one of them. This is one from my grandfather. I don't know if you can see the words on both sides, sort of the words on the other side seeping through. And these were coded, but uncensored, and they had been snuck out of Theresienstadt. So they were really a wonderful window into the history of Theresien, but also wonderful, more importantly for me, a wonderful window into these grandparents that I had never met. And these letters were filled with unknown names, names that were at least completely unknown to me. So I had to hire a researcher in Prague to help me piece together who they were, to help me piece together a family tree. And then slowly, over the course of many years, I traced family and descendants of family friends in the US, in Europe, in Israel, in Asia, in Australia. And I started going to archives and museums and all the places really that I found that my family had lived in. I started talking to historians who were very helpful and experts on the Holocaust. But then I was still solving a mystery and not yet writing a book. And eventually I discover that my father, a Czech Jew who was from Prague, who was 18 when the war started, had survived the war by deciding to travel to Berlin to hide in plain sight, and that he had lived there for 2 years. This is an official photograph that I found in the archives of the factory that he worked in, which was a factory which was producing lacquers for the Luftwaffe. And he was an official employee of this factory called Wernicke und Bohm. I also found that my father's family wasn't just Otto and Ella, but that it comprised 34 people, 29 of which were sent to camps, and 25 of whom never came back. My father was never sent to a camp because he absconded, and then he chose to go to Berlin. And as I started telling the stories of those in my family, those people that were silenced, either because they were killed or because they were too traumatized to speak, I really felt it was my duty to write them all down. And as I traced cousins all over the world, mostly around 2014 and 2016, many of whom didn't know any of the family history at all, or that they were Jewish, I promised the ones that were interested that I would do a book of all that I had uncovered. And still, that's not the book that Scribner published, because that would have been 2,000 pages long and filled with all sorts of details of little interest to anyone aside from select few in my newly discovered family. But eventually I found it important to try to convey what happened to my family, one of too many others, to a wider audience, I guess, as a way of keeping these wonderful family members that I had just acquired and discovered, the way of keeping them with me, really, and giving them somehow a little bit more life, and I guess as a way of remembrance. So it wasn't actually until 2017 that I met an agent and I put together a book proposal. And the book proposal was to tell the story of how a little girl in Venezuela solved the mystery of her dad in Prague. So the 350-page book that you can find in bookstores is only, or was only, written in 2018, once I had a book proposal. And it ended up being the story of my father's remarkable war, about his survival against all odds. But the book really runs on two levels. There are some edgy moments that belong more in a thriller, because as you may imagine, living as a young man, a Czech Jew, undercover in Berlin and working for the Nazis was pretty harrowing and exciting and terrifying. So there's some incredible thrilling moments there. But it's also, much more importantly for me, the story of how I discovered this huge, vibrant, beautiful family that I never knew anything about, and how in telling their stories I have discovered, I guess, who I really am. So thank you. Sorry I've gone on for too long.
That was very nice, Ariana. Thank you. And Helen, did you want to go next?
Sure.
Okay, and I was going to have Ruth go third. So, okay, great.
I found Ariana's story really fascinating because it fits so well into the whole spectrum of second generation experience. Ariana and I are both second generation, but I'm at the very beginning of the age group, and she and Ellie Wiesel, I think, are the very, very tail end of the age group, which basically are people who were born anywhere from 1945 to 1972, I guess. And I was also struck by the fact that these scenes from Venezuela in Children of the Holocaust, one of my chapters is about an Argentinian daughter of survivors who passes as a Protestant for her entire life in South America, and only comes out as a Jew to me when she was at the Columbia School of Journalism. And I'm fascinated also because as a child I heard about all of these Czechs that were all over South America and Venezuela and in Chile. And so it's very nice to be able to see the scenes of how she grew up. The commonality I have with Ariana is that what really triggered me to write my mother's history was her death. My mother died in 1989, in the spring before the Velvet Revolution. And so she never got to see her beloved Czechoslovakia reinstated. But her death really prompted me to look beyond the Holocaust and try and reconstruct the history of my mother's line before the Holocaust. So this is my mother that you're looking at. It's a picture of her in the 1950s. My mother was a dress designer, as was my grandmother. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is my grandmother when she was a country girl. She lived in the town of Kolín. There are 4 major historic settlements of Jews in the Czech lands outside of Prague, and Kolín was one of them. And she was a very, very poor relation of the large Saxel family, which was also known as Saudek in the places where they Czechified their name. And this is what she looked like when she was an orphan, and she lived with her very pious Aunt Rosa. And Aunt Rosa owned an old clothes store. And I assume she's wearing clothing from the old clothes store here. Next slide, please. This is grandmother Pepi. Her name at that point was Josefa Saxel, as a young woman in Prague. In 1900, she made her way to the city, and she talked herself into a job at Schiller, which was a wonderful clothing emporium on the corner of Narodní třída and, well, it wasn't called Narodní třída then. It was right in the center of Prague, near Wenceslas Square. And very quickly, she transformed herself into a city sophisticate, and very soon she became the directrice of Mr. Schiller's fashion emporium and was off to Paris and Berlin every year. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, before you go, stop, go back, please. That photograph was one of several that my mother brought out of Prague with her in 1948 when my family fled from the communists. And this photograph hung over my mother's work table because my mother continued the dress salon tradition in our home in Manhattan on the West Side. And so I saw this photograph all my life. And if I had to fasten on one object that triggered my interest in the past, it was probably this photograph. Next slide, please. So this is one of the dresses that my grandmother Pepi designed. It was found by a curator of the Prague Museum of Decorative Arts, and she sent it to me, and I'm thrilled by it. I just love it. And next slide, please. This curator also found me an advertisement for my grandmother's salon. It's at the bottom. It says Maison Weigert. Prague was very Francophile between the wars, and everybody spoke French. My mother was sent to French Lycée. And the reason it says Maison Weigert is that my grandmother married a man named Weigert from Colleen, and had a very, very, very complicated divorce and annulment of her marriage 1 year later, because it turned out he, like many men in Prague at the time, had syphilis. It was an incurable condition. And Aunt Rosa, pious Aunt Rosa from Colleen, was so furious at the matchmaker who arranged this that she had the marriage annulled. And like Ariana, I went to Prague and I found all the documentation of this. Next slide, please. These are my grandparents after divorce, after annulling the marriage with her first husband. Grandmother Pepi married engineer Emil Rabinek. So her names already were Josefa Saxel, Josefa Weigert, and now Josefa Rabinek. And that's one of the interesting things about doing historical research about women, is that their last names change all the time. So this is in 1919. Next slide, please. This is a picture of my mother, which is behind me, if you look at me. It's an oil painting. It's got an incredible provenance story. My mother went to Prague when she got Wiedergutmachung in 1964, went into the Jewish community house with her cousin Kitty, who was then the secretary to the chief rabbi of Czechoslovakia, found this hanging on the wall, said, "That's me." They took it down, they rolled it up, and she brought it to the United States. That's what she looked like at age 3 or 4. Next slide, please. That's my mother at age 17. She dropped out of Lycée because she wanted to be a dress designer like her mother. And she studied design, and at the age of 18, she inherited her mother's salon Weigert in Prague. Next slide, please. That is 1940. Like my grandmother, my mother was married twice. And this is her first husband, Josef Solar. In 1940, she was married during the occupation. And she always thought that was a very important photograph, because she also had a nose job during the occupation. And that photograph features her new nose. Next slide, please. That's the last photograph of my grandmother Pepe, taken in 1940. Next slide, please. This is a photograph. There are no photographs of my mother and Kitty during the war, although she writes about that a great deal in her book, Francie's War. That's my mother on the left side, and Kitty, her cousin, on the right. The two of them survived the war together all the time, from Prague to Terezin, to Auschwitz, to Hamburg, and they were liberated at Bergen-Belsen. I knew Kitty very well. I myself went back to Prague starting in 1968. I was caught there during the Soviet invasion, and I stayed with Kitty. Next slide, please. That's my mother and me at the beach around 1975. And I think that's it. Yes, maybe I should finish up by saying that I used my mother wrote a memoir in the early 1970s in English, typed. She gave it to me after it had been rejected by many, many, many publishing houses. One of her customers in New York was a literary agent, and she sent it around and thought she could sell it. She could not sell it. So my mother gave it to me to use as source material. I used it in my book, Where She Came From. And then in 2018, through a series of circumstances I can tell you about later, I decided to try and annotate it, fact check it, and get it published.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. So in light of both your presentations, Ruth, I wondered if you could talk maybe just a few minutes about Holocaust memoir. And I know that's a very big topic. So, but I know you've also done a lot of work in it. So I guess I was thinking of maybe just a general overview, how it's changed and developed over the last decades.
Yeah, it is thank you, Michael. And thanks both of you for those really wonderful presentations. I think there's something so intimate about seeing people's childhood photographs and family photographs that really kind of brings the material from the books, into to the reader in just a very vivid and compelling way. But so I've been thinking, about both of you and really about all of us here and our positions in relation to the Holocaust. As Michael said, the literature about the Holocaust is an enormous subject. And so I just want to say a little bit about, how we got here to this particular historical place where we are with regard to the Holocaust and all the writing that's been published, that's been created about it. And I was thinking about the way that the literary scholar David Roskies has divided up some of the foundational texts of Holocaust literature, meaning fiction, memoir, philosophy, basically everything that's not history. Dividing up all these texts into categories that delineate three phases of post-war Holocaust writing. And I want to talk about those phases just for a minute, and then to suggest that we've moved into a new phase, and talk about what that means for us and how we define this new phase. He talks about, first of all, communal memory. The memory of the community being the literature that was published immediately after the war ended. In some cases, this was literature that was written during the war, such as the diaries of Anne Frank and Eddie Hilsum. Also texts written, immediately after the war, like Ellie Wiesel's Night, which was written in slightly different form in Yiddish, and then revised to be published for a more general audience in France and elsewhere. Primo Levi's Survival at Auschwitz, Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas. And so, much of this was published in the years immediately following the war. And it didn't always receive a favorable reception. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit later with each of you. Helen, especially in light of what you just said about the circumstances around your mother trying to publish her memoir, but even for those books that did find publishers, often did so with much skepticism, with the idea that even in the early 50s already, that people already knew everything there was to know about the Holocaust, and that it wasn't useful to be dwelling on these stories from the past. The community, the Jewish community, should be moving on. The world should be moving on, and not allowing this experience to define us. And these texts, of course, were so important in creating the story of what had happened to us, constructing the narrative that has really formed the way we understand the Holocaust today, despite the lack of receptiveness from a more general public. And so then the next phase that Raskis identifies is what he calls provisional memory. And this starts in the early 60s with the Eichmann trial. And it's a period in which we see literary forms taking on a greater predominance versus the more testimonial forms that we saw in the beginning, including among survivor witnesses like Aharon Appelfeld, Jerzy Kaczynski. His book obviously is problematic for all kinds of reasons, but it was extremely popular when it was published. Also Primo Levi's Periodic Table, which is a much more literary book than Survival in Auschwitz, for instance. And this is the period when we start to see important works in response to the Holocaust by non-survivor writers like Philip Roth, William Styron, Cynthia Ozick. And so we see really the Holocaust becoming a part of literary culture in America, in Europe, in Israel, and being subsumed into this larger narrative of about Jews more generally and how we understand our lives in relation to what happened before. And so then the final period that Raskis identifies is what he calls authorized memory. And this is the period when we start to see fraudulent memoirs. Jerzy Kaczynski's book was attacked, and he was exposed in the late 1980s. We see a lot of anxiety in the literature about who has permission to speak for the survivors or to write about them. At the same time that we also start to see literature by their descendants, like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, to name maybe the most famous of these texts. And this question of permission and who has the right to speak, how do they claim that right, who gives us the right to speak, is one I want to come back to in the context of your books as well. I would just say briefly that in some cases, I think this had the effect of, Ellie Wiesel, for one, was maybe the most outspoken survivor in terms of trying to protect the Holocaust from those who we would say didn't have the right to speak about it, who would falsify facts, or would fictionalize things that many people don't believe are appropriate to fictionalize. And so we see a lot of anxiety in these works about what this kind of literature means, not only who has the right to write it, to tell it, but also about the position of fiction in relation to number one, the dying out of survivors who are no longer around to tell their stories, and also the rise of Holocaust denial around the world. And so I would just ask then, what period are we in now, and how do we define it and talk about it? And I'm sure you both know the literary scholar Marianne Hirsch, who has called it post-memory. That's the word that she uses for the relationship that, in her words, that the generation after their relationship to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, and to experiences that they, quote unquote, remember only by means of stories, images, behaviors that they grew up among. And I'll say that I have sometimes kind of struggled with this term, post memory, because of course, what she's talking about isn't really memory at all. I think, if we're accepting it as memory, it's only in the most metaphorical sense of what memory is. And certainly for Helen, I think that this term maybe applies better than it does for Ariana. Helen, you've written about growing up among a community of survivors as a member of the second generation, whereas Ariana, didn't experience this kind of post-memory in terms of the, events that her parents talked about, growing up within a culture of Holocaust survivors in which the Holocaust was sort of in the air in the way that many in the second generation, even the third generation, have found it to be, kind of a foundational part of our lives. But Hirsch also writes, that this kind of post-memory is defined by a connection to the past that, as she puts it, is mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. And that kind of imaginative investment, I think, is certainly what we see taking place in each of your work. And so, the sort of basic questions I would ask are, how do we approach the Holocaust now, here in 2022 with our different historical perspectives, the two of you, in some ways, coming from the same place, but on journeys that diverge so radically to take you to where you are now, us meeting virtually in this very different kind of space with Ariana in London, Helen and I both in the United States, and thinking about the paths that we all were on to get there. And then also the question of, so how do we approach the Holocaust? How do we pay respect now to the past from our positions here in the present? And then this question of who gets to tell the story and why. Why are the books that have become canonical, why did they become canonical rather than, books by women survivors, for instance, that were published around the same time as the memoirs by Ellie Wiesel or Primo Levi? Why didn't they get the same kinds of attention? So I'd like to start actually by talking about this question of permission. And just to open up to you, Ariana, you write about feeling that you had to have permission to tell your father's story, and the way that you kind of took that upon yourself. And Helen, I wonder how you feel also in your position growing up among these stories and your own relationship with. Did you feel that you was it a permission that you made for yourself, or was it a responsibility that you felt had always been invested in you to tell these stories, or something different altogether? So yeah, Ariana, why don't you start?
Okay, so the permission issue for me was absolutely key, I suppose, because I think when you grow up with no stories, you're also, I suppose silence is also part of a dialogue, right? And it's part of the inheritance that you get, but it's, I was most certainly not allowed to ask anything. And if I asked anything, it would cause huge distress. So it was very clear from certainly the age of, that I can remember, that I just simply could not ask any questions. I just couldn't go there. It was, for example, a little different than how my cousins grew up, because they grew up in Europe. My uncle was much more, I wouldn't say much more, but a little more open than my father, and shared some stories with them. But they were always so distressing, and so to them and to their dad, that they decided they didn't want to ask either. So we all grew up in silence for different reasons. I very much felt I didn't have permission. And my father, towards the end of his life, volunteered a tiny bit more. So by the time he died, I knew that he had spent at least a year in Berlin. But I really didn't feel I had permission at all. I mean, actually, I found that ID card and then it disappeared, completely disappeared, and I didn't see it again until I all of a sudden get this box and it's just crammed again with that ID and all these other documents, and it really felt very much like a permission. As a matter of fact, my father was a collector of all sorts of things, but collected every little scrap of paper, which was very useful to my research eventually. But it meant that his entire house in Caracas had roomfuls of papers and files of everything, every little scrap of paper. And he died, he knew he was going to die, he had had a series of strokes. He cleaned the entire house. And when I went to Venezuela after he died, thinking I'm going to spend 2 weeks sorting through all this mess of papers that I really don't want to go through, and it's going to be incredibly, a huge job, he had cleared everything except for a few letters from my mother, a few letters from me, a few little documents that he thought I needed, and this box. So it was very explicit. Here it is. Here you have whatever it is I can share with you. And he also, and they're not as well written and they're not as long as Helen's memoirs, he left me some writings about his time in Berlin, written in 92 to 95. So he left me 25 pages of his recollections. So I then had to do a little bit like Helen. I had to go in and well, fact check and check the addresses and check the names, and indeed make sure and edit, because they were typewritten as well, and they were written in Spanish, which was my father's, I think, sixth language, so they were poorly written. But anyways, so yes, permission was very important in my case.
Helen, how did that play out for you? If it did, would you use the word permission, or how do you think about that?
No, I wouldn't use the word permission. And the other word that gives me a lot of trouble is post-memory. I've never understood the term post-memory. I don't find it very useful in having interviewed now thousands of children of Holocaust survivors. I don't think any of us see ourselves as imaginatively taking part in our parents' experiences. I mean, we were witnesses to our parents' recounting of their experiences, or of our parents acting out of their experiences, or, as Ariana has just told us, of waking up in the middle of the night to our parents' screams. That wasn't my case. My parents apparently didn't have very many nightmares. They talked about this stuff during the day, but that I just don't see what that has to do with post-memory. So just a comment on that. Permission, I think it was very, I would have asked my father's permission to write about all of this when I was writing Children of the Holocaust, which was back in the early 70s. But my father died in 1974. And looking back on it, I have to say that it made my work a lot easier, because I knew that to write about it was going to cause him a lot of pain. He was more reticent about talking about his personal losses than my mother was. And then the third thing that just popped out at me when you were talking was Ellie Wiesel's insistence that Holocaust literature be fact-based, basically, and his idea about who was had the necessary accreditation to write about it. I think it's worth pointing out that Ellie Wiesel, like myself, was a journalist, and he came from a fact-based point of view as far as writing goes. So I think the issue of fictionalizing the Holocaust is an extremely thorny one. This man named Patrick something in the Irish Times wrote a really, really good piece about Holocaust fiction and Holocaust nonfiction. And what he pointed out was the tremendous role of marketing in all of this, and how publishers find it easier to market fiction because they can sensationalize it, and authors can use the material in a way that is very dramatic. I mean, we saw this all back in 1978 when the Holocaust series, the mini-series, was on television, or in Schindler's List when the survivors come back in Technicolor. So all of these are very interesting issues. In terms of permission, I think apart from my father's permission, I didn't feel like I needed anybody's permission, because I had listened and watched these people all my life, the survivors, and I was not trying to write their experience or even think I was in their experience. In fact, I couldn't imagine being in their experience. But what I could do was write down what they said.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I find what you say about literature so provocative, of course. I wonder, in terms of the term post memory, I wonder if that prefix post is meant to sort of cancel out the idea that it's memory at all. And just that we've moved into a place beyond memory where the term memory doesn't really apply. But yeah, as I said, I share your difficulty with it. And I wonder then, in terms of the problems with fictionalizing and sensationalizing, we know that a lot of the reasons that people fictionalize these stories is simply to make them into better stories. And Ariana, you said during your talk that if you were to publish what you had found, it would be 2,000 pages, and it wouldn't be readable as the memoir, the family memoir that you've written. We all have to do some kind of shaping and narrative construction in order to make a book, to make it into a story. And I'm curious to hear how you went about that. How did you decide what to keep in and what to take out? And then Helen, maybe you could talk about a little that process as you experienced it with your mother's memoir.
Helen, do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to go ahead?
Whatever. Go ahead.
Okay.
You start.
So, I mean, it's Helen. I've just had a blank, so
I'll go and you can think.
Go ahead. Sorry, I'm trying to sort of.
It happened to me the other day.
I mean, anyways,
yeah. How do you shape the story? Well, in my mother's case, it was very, very easy. She had written a memoir. It was rather short. It was typewritten on onion skin paper. I was just amazed to read it in 2018 because, of course, Me Too was all the rage in 2018. And here was this manuscript that was talking about sex and power and same-sex relationships in the camps, and her relationship with her cousin Kitty, which, as I said, continued, from their childhood through the war until both of them died. And so it was about women's relationships. It was about all this stuff. And I thought, oh, this is absolutely so timely. And then when I read it, having not looked at it since 1997, when I used it for Where She Came From, I thought, this is absolutely perfect the way it is. The only thing that I'm going to tinker with is an occasional malapropism. And I didn't like the foreword she wrote because it was extremely dated. She talked about the Vietnam War and how she sympathized with the American students who were protesting the Vietnam War. She talked about West Germany and East Germany. And I thought, I don't want to rewrite this. I'd rather just take it out. So I just took it out and left the rest exactly as it was. And she took a really, really small chunk of time. Her original title for the memoir was Round Trip because it began in Prague in 1938 and it returned to Prague in 1945, and it went through all of these camps. And so I left it exactly as it was, but I fact-checked everything. And fact-checking it was fabulous. I had such a good time. I knew most of the people, or many of the people, who were in her memoir because many of the women survivors kept in touch after the war. And also many Czech Jewish survivors wrote memoirs. There are about 10 of them who wrote memoirs. And so maybe even more, maybe there are a dozen. And my mother knew them too. They're all listed in the bibliography of Where She Came From. So I really didn't do anything. I was very impressed by the way my mother shaped the story because she was very smart for somebody who was not a professional writer. She took a really clear, delineated time frame and kept within it. And she also had the same set of characters go all the way through it. So it was for somebody who wasn't a writer, it was brilliant.
It's fascinating. I would love to just follow up with a question. How did you fact check it? What did fact checking entail in this situation? And
I'll tell you two stories which are fabulous. Very, very dramatic stories, kind of like in Ariana's narrative. So the first story is that my mother was imprisoned in 1939, long before the camps for her, in Prague, because her first husband's mother was hiding jewelry with a Czech colonel. And she describes this scene in Pankratz prison, which is a notorious Czech prison. It's like Sing Sing in the United States. And she was in prison with two older women. She was 19 years old, and she was with these two middle-aged women. And she described one of them as a kind of dramatic spy, actress, opera singer who was just amazingly sophisticated and a woman of the world. Well, out of the blue, this is because of the internet, I got an email from this guy in Berlin who said, this woman who your mother was in prison with in 1939 was my father's first wife. And in fact, I think your mother's wrong. She was not in prison in 1939. She was beheaded in 1943 in that prison. And so that's why I dug out my mother's memoir, actually. So I dug out my mother's memoir, I scanned the page, I sent it to him. And it turned out that he was wrong and my mother was right. She was, in fact, in prison. And there's enough stuff now online that substantiates it. So without the internet, there's no way I could have done this. But the more moving substantiation was my mother and her first husband adopted a child, an orphan, in Theresienstadt. This was apparently a thing. They asked young couples to adopt young kids. And my mother adopted this little girl who was very, very emotionally disturbed. She had lost both of her parents. She was quite young. She was really, really upset. And she wouldn't talk until she heard my mother saying something to her husband in English. And at that point she said, oh, you speak English, you're going to have to teach me English. So there's that whole long story. And I thought, wow, how do I even find out whether this woman exists? So what do? Being a journalist, I thought I'm going to go on Jewish Genealogy Facebook page where they've got God knows how many people. And I'm going to say, I have this story about this 12-year-old girl orphaned in Theresienstadt. She had an older brother. Does anyone know anything about her? And sure enough, not only did I get confirmation, but I got her picture. And her picture, I believe, is in some of the editions of my mother's book.
That is amazing. And I mean, I think it's credit to you and your journalistic background, but it's so important also because, most Holocaust memoirs are not fact-checked like this. And, and because of that, historians have traditionally been, reasonably skeptical about using them as sources in a way that's sometimes been problematic. So, I congratulate you for making your mother's memoir, is useful historically in a way that it might not otherwise have been. Ariana, I want to come back to you in the 2,000 pages of your hypothetical original manuscript. Can you talk about the process of
Yes, of course.
making all those facts into your book?
It was. I mean, what I really did with my book is, I originally, when I thought I should tell the story, was driven by my father's remarkable story of survival. I thought there was a natural narrative arc there. And when I first went to my agent, I said, I want to write a book about my father and his family, possibly starting in 1938, and then follow them through to 1945. This is what I have uncovered. And she said, that's great, but the story is going to be you uncovering that. And I was very reticent about doing that because I didn't think I could pit myself. I have a very boring middle-class life. I couldn't pit myself in with these people who lived through extraordinary times. And she basically said, I'm not going to be your agent if you don't do this because your book is never going to sell. which is maybe something we could talk about later on, about how you sometimes have to market Holocaust books as something else than Holocaust books. But so what I really did with my story, it wasn't that I shaped it as such, because my father's story again is very thrilling and has a very natural narrative arc. So that's the driver, I would say. And then the other thing, actually, which was also very natural, was the fact that I'm just a geek detective. I still am that little girl, aged 9, who, all my friends call whenever they want anything found out online or anywhere. And I just love scouring, archives and finding answers for things. So again, and so it's really just how I uncovered the story. And what I really had to trim down was my grandfather was one of 8. My grandmother was one of 4. There were masses of stories. And I scoured every possible archive, because I was helped by a brilliant guy who's a filmmaker who initially translated my letters. I think someone asked who translated my letters, but who called Lucas Privel. And Lucas, who has done some beautiful documentaries called Forgotten Transports, basically said, check everything. Don't just fact check, and don't just go to the Jewish register. Don't just go to the genealogy website. Go to the police records, go to the tax records, go to all these things. You will find lots of stories there. So I had all sorts of material of my father's cousins, of my father's uncles, everything from, and unfortunately, when you go to police files, you find a lot of criminal things. So there were a couple, basically Scribner said, we're just doing your father and your grandparents. And I managed to sneak in there a couple of their cousins, one who was in a clandestine school, just because I thought this story was rather beautiful, and one which was harrowing and deserved to be in there, which was my father's cousin Otto, who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1941 in a matter of a few days. So they let me do that. They weren't thrilled, because they wanted very much that I focus or zoom in on people. So it wasn't so much that I had to shape it. I just had to not tell a bunch of stories, which of course is, again, you're changing the narrative by not telling some of the stories as well. So I'm very, very aware of that. And then anything that I included, I tried to fact check as well by, having Anna Hashkova, who just gave a lecture with you, Michael, read it through, and Dan Stone, who's a Holocaust and camp expert, and again, Lucas Privel, who's Czech. But I also went to archives, and I tried not to include anything at all that I didn't have to completely distinct sources for. So if it was, my 2 of my cousins who grew up together had the same story, that didn't count. It really had to be, I had to have a family anecdote and some sort of verifiable record. And I sort of did, I had a situation, Helen, when you were talking about imprisoning, where I had to do reverse fact check, which is when I had a mass of memoirs that people related to my story had written, and testimony, mostly written testimony, memoirs, recollections written in the 60s and 70s about the war. And I had a lot of those. A lot of them didn't have dates, so it was very difficult to know what they were about. And there were some that I just couldn't place. And then at some stage, when I'm looking at all the archives in the Jewish Museum in Prague, I find my uncle's card. And I was quite sure, and the family narrative was, that my uncle never went to a camp. He was never imprisoned. And there was his card with his name, date of birth. It was definitely him. And there was a big stamp saying Haft imprisoned, with a date in February 1945. And I thought, I called my cousin. I said, your father was actually in prison. Did you know that he was in hiding? And she said, absolutely not. And then eventually, we just couldn't figure it out. And then eventually I found 2 anecdotes, actually, and one which Stenka had written, called The False Imprisonment. And it turns out that because he had absconded so my uncle absconded from a transport, he had been protected by being in a mixed marriage, and he had actually worked at the Council of Elders. So he had to write his own transport notice. But he, anyways, he knew, but he didn't, he just like my father had absconded, he absconded as well, but the Gestapo were looking for him. So he decided to stage with this wonderful wife that he had, who wasn't Jewish and who was incredibly brave. He decided to stage a false arrest so that the neighbors heard all this commotion, and they actually paid off a Czech policeman who just pretended to grab him and beat him up, and they made an enormous amount of noise so that the neighbors had, seen and heard all this happen. And then Stenka went to the police station and cried and sobbed and said, where have you taken my husband? Which is why the card had that stamp. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you often need, when you're doing this research, you need to go and look at the facts, look at the files, look at the archives, but you can't necessarily just assume that because it says imprisoned, the person was indeed in
What a
prison.
great story. And yeah, I think that's such an important cautionary tale for biographers or historians or anybody trying to do this kind of work. We have a tendency to believe things that are written down on paper. And it's so important to be able to corroborate things and to make sure that there isn't that kind of misunderstanding. Because, of course, why would you not assume that because you have this piece of paper that says in prison that somebody was not, in fact, imprisoned? That's just incredible. So I see that we already have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I want to invite people to continue posting their questions. I want to continue this conversation among us for a little while longer, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. Helen, I wonder maybe if you could talk a little bit now about the reception that your mother's book received when she first tried to publish it, and how, in what ways have things changed since then, and in what ways have they not changed maybe as much as we might like?
Well, I think I'm probably the oldest person among the four of us here, and I'd like you to think about when I was in journalism school, which was 1970 to 1971. It's probably hard for you to believe this, but there was not a single woman full-time professor at Columbia School of Journalism.
I believe it.
There were two adjuncts. Judith Crist, the film critic, was an adjunct, and a woman named Soma Golden was an adjunct, but it was completely male. The publishing industry in 1970-71 was a little bit better. There were some women around, but it was also largely a male preserve. And in the case of the New York publishing industry, it was largely male and Jewish, which is a kind of interesting thing that I wish somebody would write about.
There's a new book coming out about it by Josh Lambert.
Oh, good.
Called The Literary Mafia. And yes, please continue.
I wonder whether he'll take this up. One of the consequences of this was that it was two things. It was A, misogynistic and not a very pleasant place for women to flourish. But B, it was very indifferent, if not anti the survivors who had come from Europe, many of whom were very literary people. And there was this sense of wanting to differentiate and to put a distance between American Jews, some of whom had come over in the early 30s, to differentiate between the victims, so-called, of Nazism and the people who had gotten here before, which I always found ridiculous. I went to elementary school on the Upper West Side, and I didn't find out until 50 years later that some of my classmates who I thought were American had actually come to New York maybe 8 years before my parents did, and always treated my parents as though they were something very different from themselves. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think there was a real, I don't know what to call it. There may be a class difference, maybe a professional difference. The fact that my mother was a dress designer and a dressmaker and not a literary person or a professional who had a PhD, I think went against her. My mother's best friend was a woman named Hannah Wynne, who was Janet Malcolm's mother. They were best friends. And Jana's mother, Janet's mother, was a lawyer by training, and her father was a psychiatrist. And I always felt that in New York City, in the refugee community, and I say refugee community to include those who came before the war, because Janet's parents did come before the war, there was this difference between refugees who had succeeded in continuing their professional training in the United States, as her psychiatrist father had, or people whose professional lives were destroyed. I mean, in the case of my father had been an Olympic athlete, and he had played in 2 Olympic games. Unfortunately, his sport was water polo, and nobody in New York City played water polo. So his professional life was totally wrecked. So all of that played a role in who got published in American publishing in the post-war period, or in the 50s, or in the 60s, or in the 70s. And in each country, it was different. I don't know the situation in the UK, but I know that in France, just like in the United States, it was a matter of who you knew. And Wiesel was very close friends with a very influential person in France who was able to help him get published immediately. In Israel, it was the same thing. I think in Israel, the misogyny was even greater. I think that the number of women writers in Israel was almost minimal until maybe the 1980s.
Yeah, it was a different time for sure. I wondered for both of you, if you could just give a little advice for those who might be considering writing a family memoir. Were there any literary models that you referred to? Were there, how to begin looking for sources? Ariana, why don't you start?
Okay, so well, sources, I mean, again, I think I spoke a little bit about this, but just don't just, I mean, I suppose you have to start with Genie is a great website if you come from a European Jewish family. There's lots of people like Randy Schoenberg who have traced many families and have put up a lot of documents. And I immediately put in a couple of people and it linked to a bunch of others. So that was very useful. I don't speak Czech, so I had a huge handicap, and I had to get translators. And again, getting translators is complicated because you can't just go to the Czech embassy and get a translator from 2021 because they won't understand the language. So you have to get someone who is conversant in 1940s Czech, for example. So
yeah.
So that was a challenge. There are lots of people out there that I was incredibly helped by. Again, Anna Hashkova and Dan Stone, and who doesn't speak Czech, but and Lucas Pribble, and a wonderful. So I went to the Jewish Museum and I said, I need help. Can someone do a bit of research in the Czech in the Czech archives for me? So there was a wonderful woman called Magda Veselska who did a lot of the preliminary research, and that was mostly in the Jewish National Archives and the Jewish Archives and the National Archives and the different town archives. And that, I mean, I think it's important to start with that. Then obviously ask as many questions as you can of everyone around you. Direct questions rarely for me got me the answers I wanted. So you have to have long conversations about, if you're trying to remember something about someone's childhood, talk to them about breakfast, because that might actually elicit all these memories that if you sort of say, were you a happy child, or how did you go to school in the mornings, you just direct questions when you're talking about a conflicted past rarely give you the answers that you seek. So be patient and ask lots of questions. And I remember talking to my cousin and asking her, I mean, about 15 times, how you must have a way of finding Stenka, this marvelous woman, and she kept saying no. And then one day, sort of after 50 hours of conversation, she said, we were talking about, she's a painter, and we were talking about her art, and she connected the art to the fact that this gallerist who had gone out with Stenka, who had been Stenka's Stenka's daughter's boyfriend. Anyways, it was a very convoluted way, but I found her through that. So be patient, scour all the archives. You get gems in police archives, amongst other things, and just look at bank accounts and receipts, and and then I suppose once you're actually crafting the story, my advice would be, do not falsify anything. Include things that you can actually verify, of course, but you have, it's all about how you tell it, right? So if you tell the story in a way that is engaging, you will connect to more people, and it's not about Disneyfying the story or pretending, or removing nasty bits and making it more thrilling than it really is. It's just about the narrative voice, I think, and the placing of how you how you piece the story together, really. So I think that's it. Just try to gather as much material as you can, and then put it all on a table, do a timeline, and figure out the actual historical timeline and the way you're going to tell it, and that, I think that's my advice.
Great advice. Helen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, actually. When I did family history workshops, I would start out by telling people you don't have to write a book. You can start out by looking at your family photographs and just writing on the back of them who they are. And if you don't know who they are, try and find out who they are and try and find out the date. Because either if your kids inherit these photographs, they'll have no idea who these people are. And if you decide to donate your photographs, as I recently did, to a museum, they won't know either. So you'd be helping a lot of people out. The second thing I do is I tell people, first of all, make a timeline. Figure out what time you are. I guess I'm a little obsessed with time because I was so struck by this in my mother's book. But what is your timeline? How far back are you going? Are you going back to the 18th century? Or are you going back to 1941? And then try and make a chronological timeline. And next to it, write down what you have and what you don't have and what you'd like to find out. Then I tell people, writing a book is overrated, and get straight in your head why you're doing this. Are you doing this to write it for yourself? Are you doing this to write it for your family? Are you doing this for fame and fortune? I can tell you right away, your chances of fame and fortune are very slim, and your chances of having your family read it are not much greater. So I would say, figure out what your objectives are. And then I often would tell them, you live in a time of the internet. Maybe it would be just as good to make a website. And you could make an interactive website where all kinds of people could interact with you and add things all from all over the world. So I think writing a book is a very, very, very complicated, long endeavor, and not always leading to the kind of fame and fortune that people envisage. So if you're going to do that, what I always told my journalism students was, before you start writing, you have to read. And I would send them to the morgue, which was the name for the clipping place in the basement of whatever newspaper was nearby. But here I would say, go to your library. I spent a year haunting the stacks of the Harvard libraries before I started writing my mother's book. And not my mother's book, but my book about my mother's family. And it was just amazing to read, because before you write about your family, you have to find out how to situate them in their culture and in their historical context. And I found one of the most interesting things about writing about my mother, the dress designer, was, why are there so many Jews in the clothing industry? And I was really interested in pursuing that. And as I did my research, I found out that my great-grandfather was in the liquor business. And I thought, yeah, the Bronfmans, why did the Jews get into the liquor business? And I found myself researching all of that. And I think only after you have a sense of the history, both of the Jewish history, the communal history, and the country history, or the regional history, in our cases, that's Central Europe, can you really begin with your family story? So I think that to do it seriously, it's a very, very, very long enterprise. And but it's an extremely interesting one because, of course, when you read, you're also entertained as well as informed.
Fantastic points, both of you. Okay, we have a lot of questions. I'm skimming through them. Here's an interesting one that says, for somebody who says, I know the few stories that were talked about when my sister and I were children, but I'm trying to create a more complete narrative about my family's pre-Holocaust lives. Do you have suggestions for filling in the large gaps in their stories in order to create a complete narrative while respecting the desire to be historically accurate? And yeah, I think that's a really really compelling problem. How do you address the gaps in the historical narrative?
Shall I go?
Yeah, whoever wants to go first. So go ahead, Ellen.
One popped completely to mind. In the case of my mother's history, not my mother's, but my great-grandmother's history, we're back now in the middle of the 19th century. Obviously, there wasn't too much stuff, and especially about women's lives. And what I did, since I was writing nonfiction very consciously as a journalist, so I don't make things up, and I also tell the reader when I don't know, I would tell the reader, I don't know what's going on here, but I would then do some research and read stuff that other people wrote during that time. So my great-grandmother was the daughter of this innkeeper. And I know that from my mother's stories, but I don't know much more about that. My mother didn't know much more about that. And so what I did was I looked up Central European literature. I looked up innkeepers. I looked up innkeepers' daughters. And I didn't only look at history. I looked at novels and I looked at folk songs. And there are folk songs about the Jewish innkeeper's daughter with the beautiful black eyes, and the local nobleman falls in love with her, blah, blah, blah. So I stuck that in and told the reader, look, I don't know what went on here. My suspicion is that my great-grandmother fell in love with some guy who pursued her. It didn't work out. She was married off to this Jewish guy that I knew from the archives. But here's some options. You know, here's this folk song. Here's this, I forget the guy's name right now. The novel was called Kinder der Rander. Rander was the Jewish manager of the nobleman's estate. And the nobleman would come to the inn and he'd flirt with the wife and with the daughter and all this stuff. So that's what I did.
I did much the same, Helen. I mean, I think you have to accept that there are going to be gaps in what you can find. I mean, I had whole, months in 1943 to 44, for example, where I had no idea what my uncle really was doing, and I say that to the reader, and I also say, I mean, at some stage when my grandparents are in Theresienstadt in 43, I don't quite know how, and I was writing a very detailed description of their everyday life because I had all their letters, but I didn't have any documents as to what my father and his brother were doing for the holidays, for example. So, and I say that, I said, I have no idea how Hans and Lothar spent this winter. And again, I didn't make anything up at least not consciously. I mean, I just think when you take stories that are given to you by other people that are written down 50 years after the event, you always have some sort of, I don't know if it's fictionalizing. People insert their own family narratives, right? The more that someone tells a story, the more details they seem to gain. So I guess that's what. But there's a moment, for example, in my book, pretty early on, where I say I imagine my grandparents, I conjure them, and I can see them in their house. And now that is. I think I do that a couple of times. It was based on family stories that I had. It was based on going around the house where my grandparents were, and I just talk about an afternoon in September. I don't obviously give a date, and I talk about my grandmother and my waiting for my father. And again, it was a compilation of different stories. I couldn't go to the archives and see whether it matched up. But again, as a writer, I think you just say, this is how I imagine them. And again, the whole thing about reading around is very, very useful, because my grandfather, for example, also adopted a girl in Theresienstadt who was a Mischling. So her parents, she turned 12 and went to Theresienstadt, I think in 43, and she had been a neighbor of my grandfather's. But when I first found those letters, I didn't understand what it meant when he was talking about his adoptee effectively. So I did read other things, and I wish I had read your mother's, but it wasn't published at the time. But again, you do find a lot by reading around and reading other material of the time. So
here's a very evocative question. Can you talk a bit about your relationship with your parent? Your relationship with your parent as a subject, and the process of turning your parent into a character in your.
Ariana, you first on this one.
Oh, gosh, my father. My father was a real character in my life. It's interesting because my relationship with my father, I adored him and I felt very close to him, but he was very distant because he was very damaged and very traumatized. And it was very, again, it was very interesting because of my process of discovery. The man when I was born, my father was 50, and I think we never really think about our parents before we came along, right? Not until we're much older. So the man that I was born to was disciplined and strict and was always on time, and he was a workaholic, and he never discussed feelings. He never discussed things that he considered tonterías, silly things. So he was hard to he was hard to penetrate, and he was hard to sort of bond with, because he never asked. I mean, not that I had many boyfriends in my 20s, but the ones I did, he wasn't interested in stuff like that. So his way of bonding was talking about politics and doing all these things, and he was just so serious and so impenetrable, really. And then all of a sudden I discover all these papers, including some really bad poetry that he wrote in 1939. I mean, just atrocious. I mean, really atrocious, probably even misogynistic, not misogynistic, but definitely sort of, anyways, it was not. But the other thing I discovered is, I mean, he had it. And I thought the letters that we're talking about him were actually about someone else. So I'm sure your family is the same, Helen. My family used all, and that made the research very difficult. They didn't. My father was Hans, but he was also Handa and Hando, and the unfortunate one, and H. So there were all sorts of different little nicknames. So at first I thought they were talking about a different Handa in these letters, because I didn't recognize my father in them. They were talking about this boy who was always late, who wasn't studying, that he was studying chemistry, but what he was doing was, using his knowledge to build stink bombs to throw at the Germans. It wasn't at all the person that I recognized as my father. So it was interesting because there was already again a distance between me and this young boy. That was sort of easy to write about, because again, there was a narrative arc. It's a sort of young boy poet, shambolic, who's always late, who really is actually quite a sensitive soul, who then goes through 2 years in Berlin. And I've just seen this question about my father working for the Nazis. I just wanted to clarify that he worked for a Nazi factory, making lacquers. He was very junior. So I again, I'm not minimizing what he did. He was trying to survive, but he wasn't. He certainly wasn't. I just read working for the Nazis, and it spooks me a bit. He was actually, his best friend, who wasn't Jewish, was also working in the same factory. But there was an easy narrative there of this man who is then so transformed by the war that he becomes the man that is then my very loved and slightly and distant father. So I already had a distance, if that makes any sense, from my father, which made it perhaps a little bit easier to write about him. But of course, he's always my dad, right? I mean, so I don't really see him as a character, except when I'm thinking about it and talking about it with you. But when I was writing it, it was certainly very much as evidenced by my children. Who my daughter said the other day, "Do you realize you spent a whole year behind your computer just in tears?" So I don't know that when you're talking about things like this, they ever really. I wish they were just characters sometimes, because it would have made the process much easier.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things that really struck me when I was writing Children of the Holocaust was because so many members of our families were murdered. Most of us grew up only with our parents, and there were no other significant adults really around. So I certainly was totally enthralled to both of my parents. And in my case, I was more obsessed with my mother than my father. My father was, I think, the healthier of the two parents mentally. And he was also an athlete. So he had a very rigorous physical regimen that kept him very positive and happy. If the sun was out, he was a happy man. So what did I do about my mother as a character? Since I was doing it so early, I started writing Children of the Holocaust in the late 60s. So many of her contemporaries were still around. And I made it my business to interview all of them before they died. And because I started going to Prague in 1968, I could interview her cousin Kitty at length. And Kitty was like my mother's younger sister. I mean, she was a cousin, but their relationship was like younger sister to older sister. So she had a great critique of my mother. And luckily, my mother's best friend was still alive. She was a non-Jewish woman in Prague who had been in the resistance, in the Czech resistance. And she remembered going to tea dances with my mother and dancing the tango, which was so outlandish to me, the idea of my mother dancing the tango, because my mother was such a serious, grim person most of the time. And so I think the advice I would give to the person who asked the question was try and interview as many people as you can who saw your parent in a different way. It doesn't, at this point in time, it's difficult to find contemporaries of your parent, but you can certainly find other people who knew your parent and have definite ideas about them. In my case, actually, Janet Malcolm's younger sister was close friends with my mother, and she was very, very helpful. She's also a journalist, and she was very helpful in giving me insights into my mother. Colleagues, work colleagues, people who looked up to your parent, saw them in a totally different way, are very, very helpful to interview. And they also help to give you distance on this person as a character rather than your parent.
Fantastic. Well, I see that we're reaching the end of our time period.
Yeah, we can save the questions just so the audience knows, and we can go through them and answer some of them personally via email perhaps later, because we have everyone's registration. So
Well, that would be good. I was just thinking, there's someone that actually, who is the grandson of an artist that my father loved. And please feel free to share, I'm sure, Helen, you feel the same, our emails, and we're happy to.
all right, yeah, I will. I'll go through them and send them out to the people, the correct people here today. Then you could, all three of you can respond or not as you see fit. Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, thank you all for being part of this. That was a wonderful conversation. Ruth, thank you so much for your moderation. And Ariana, thank you for joining us. And Helen, thank you for joining us. As many of us here are probably part of the Leo Baeck Institute book club, I will just say on June 6th, we're going to be discussing Helen's book, Where She Came From, A Daughter's Search for Her Mother's History. And we're going to be reading Ariana's book later in the fall. So When Time Stops. So if you're in the book club now, you've met both authors, but we'll be discussing each of their book in much more personal detail in a much more intimate setting with them both. So you can find out more information about the book club on the website as well. And then we also have it's called LBI Book Club on Facebook. So, all right. I thank you all.